Aleister Crowley's historical theory. What was Aleister Crowley's model of history? What are the aeons he describes? What is the nature of Crowley's description of aeons? How do they differ from concepts such as the ages or yugas of Evola or the seasons of Oswald Spengler or any other sort of model of historical mapping? We do know some things about the nature of the aeons from Crowley and others who are affiliated with his movement. Aeons do not represent a certain length of time. So, for instance, an aeon is not an astrological age or a precession of the equinox, etc., and can last vastly different lengths, and can and have lasted vastly different lengths. We've passed through two aeons over the course of recorded human history, and are either on the cusp or within a third, according to Crowley and his followers. Aeons do not represent a trend of historical or civilization decay or advance necessarily, such as the season or ages in other theorists like Spengler and Evola's works. Ions do not last for any particular set time or for a standardized length of time. They are not a method of historical measurement. So, like they are not, such as how they are not a form of measuring something like an equinox precession or anything to do with astrology, they're not a certain set amount of years measured in uh, Greenwich Meridian time. There are two aeons the world has passed through over the course of recorded history, the Aeon of Isis and the Aeon of Osiris. We are now said to be constantly in the course of entering the Aeon of Horus, or already within it, according to some of the theorists that came after Crowley. The Aeon of Isis began with the agricultural revolution. Its religious form was paganistic or shamanistic. It reached its apex from Mesopotamian cultures and the worship of the goddess Isis in Egypt. The purpose of religious discovery and experience during the Aeon of Isis was the understanding of natural phenomenon, movement of the tides, aging and death, growth of crops, clouds producing rain, and so on. I also forgot to write here, but the nature of the paganism and shamanism, according to Crowley's theory, during this period in Mesopotamia and Egypt, was the term would be matriarchal in nature, essentially worship of the female form above the male form, and and would also be centered around the moon as opposed to the sun. The Aeon of Osiris found its inception around the period in which the myth of Osiris itself was given the central position amongst the cults of ancient Egypt. So the myth in which Osiris is killed by Set, he is revived by Isis, gives birth. Isis through Osiris gives birth to Horus, and then Horus slays or battles Set, and reached its period with the Abrahamic hegemony over most of the world in the early 1800s to the early 1900s. The purpose of Osirian religion is an attempt to catalogue and greater understand the internal, the psychological, the spiritual, whatever one wishes to call it, and to attempt to discover what happens to an ego after death. I also forgot to write this down here, but obviously, it's obvious compared to the Aeon of Isis. According to Crowley, Osirian religion is paternalistic and focused on the male in terms of its worship of deity, and is centered around the sun, essentially sun worship. So the cults of Osiris in Egypt, the Aten cult in Egypt, and then Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which were all interpreted to either be masculine sky or sun worshipping religions to an extent or the other by Crowley. The Aeon of Horus is named such by Crowley due to its nature of being a synthesis of both the Aeons of Osiris and Isis, thus their son Horus from the old fable, containing within it the gods of both of their religious models, but cleaned of perceived impurities. The obvious one that Crowley disagreed with within the Aeon of Osiris was church or ecclesial hierarchies, or the idea of essentially obedience to institutions like the Catholic Church, Church of England, so on and so forth. Essentially, a Nietzschean critique of a lot of Christianity was also a big part of it. The religious structure of the Aeon of Horus is, as one may expect, claimed to be similar or identical to Crowley's spiritual or religious system, that being essentially Thelema and the other interlocking works he produced while he was with the Golden Dawn and with other groups he led or became a member of. The world is in a constant state of entering the Aeon of Horus as the Aeon of Osiris began to fade after the events of the early 20th to the early 1900s when it began to severely fade, essentially the crisis of the modern world. The lifespan of an Aeon is simply determined by the willingness of the general population to earnestly uphold and live by its religious structures. The Aeons of Isis and Osiris both fade due to increasing nihilism, atheism, and base materialism. Essentially, I once read a book about this. Essentially the Aeon of Isis, which would have been the paganism and shamanism of Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, antiquity Greece, early Rome, some Persian sects, India. These societies, very similar to the idea of the autumn or civilizational winter talked about by Spengler, became increasingly less religious and less dominated by religious, like they essentially more atheism began to spring in society over time, and this led to a general, in Crowley's view, the death of that particular aeon. And essentially, what we now talk about the crisis of the modern world, Grenon, Evola, Nietzsche, to a degree Marx, and so forth. Essentially, that is the crisis and death of the Aeon of Osiris. So yeah, the Aeon of Horus was supposed to negate these fetters, but itself could still fall prey to them in the future, should the faith, which would obviously be essentially Crowley's Nietzschean-inspired neo-pagan spiritualism, be forgotten or rejected by the people en masse.